Vivian is just feeling a little emotional right now, my husband announced nervously to the crowded ballroom, holding his hands up, desperately trying to block my access to the microphone podium. He smiled a tight, panicked smile at our two children, his corporate colleagues, and his mistress, who was sitting at table 4. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply held up the thick, manila envelope containing his secret lakeside condo lease, his offshore bank transfers, and his handwritten exit strategy. "I was emotional last week, Graham," I replied, my voice echoing crystal clear through the speakers. "Tonight, I'm documented. My name is Vivian Hartley. I am 47 years old, and I spent 23 years building a life, a family, and a home with a man I thought I knew. And to understand how I ended up dismantling his entire carefully constructed reality in front of 200 people, we have to go back to a quiet Thursday evening, exactly 1 month ago. It was 8 o'clock at night in our sprawling suburban home in Michigan. The house was incredibly quiet. Our 24-year-old son, Miles, was living downtown working at an architectural firm. Our 19-year-old daughter, Lila, had just left for her sophomore year of college, out of state a few weeks prior. For the first time in over 2 decades, Graham and I were truly empty nesters. I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing a wine glass, enjoying the quiet domestic rhythm of the evening. Graham was upstairs, supposedly taking a long shower after a grueling day running his company, Hartley Precision Manufacturing. He had left his phone sitting face up on the marble island. Normally, I never looked at his phone. In 23 years of marriage, I had never felt the need to. We shared an iCloud account for family photos. We knew each other's passcodes, and we operated on a foundation of absolute trust. But as I reached for a dish towel, the screen of his phone lit up. Cutting through the dim lighting of the kitchen, a text message notification had popped up. It wasn't from a saved contact. It was just a local phone number. I glanced at the screen, expecting to see a late-night message from one of his factory floor managers about a supply chain issue. Instead, I read 7 words that stopped the air in my lungs. Last night meant everything to me. I froze. The dish towel slipped from my hand and fell onto the hardwood floor. I stared at the glowing screen. The world tilted on its axis, a slow, sickening rotation that made my stomach drop. 23 years, 2 children, a lifetime of shared memories, anniversaries, and vows, all of it shattered by a single sentence hovering on a piece of backlit glass. Most women, in that exact moment, would have screamed. Most women would have grabbed the phone, marched up the stairs, kicked the bathroom door open, and confronted their husband in a blind, hysterical rage. But I didn't scream. A strange, freezing calm washed over me. It was the absolute, terrifying clarity of a woman realizing that the man sleeping next to her was a stranger. I picked up his phone. I unlocked it, using the passcode I had known for years. The year we bought our first house. I opened the text thread. There were no other messages. He had clearly been deleting them, but had sent this one while he was in the shower, catching him off guard. I didn't type a question. I didn't ask who she was. I typed exactly 5 words. "Come over. She's gone." Graham, I hit send. Then I deleted the notification, locked the phone, set it back down on the marble island in the exact position I had found it, and picked up my dish towel. I waited. 12 minutes later, the doorbell rang. The chime echoed through the large, empty house like a starting pistol. I walked slowly from the kitchen through the foyer and reached for the brass handle of the heavy oak front door. I pulled it open. Standing on my front porch was Serena Vale. She was 49, a wealthy widow who ran a boutique event consulting firm that frequently contracted with Graham's manufacturing company. She was elegant, dressed in a sleek cashmere wrap and dark designer jeans. She was holding a bottle of expensive red wine. The moment she saw my face, the soft, seductive smile on her lips vanished instantly. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking completely ashen under the porch light. "Vivian," Serena choked out, taking a sudden, stumbling step backward. I thought. You thought I was gone." I finished the sentence for her, my voice perfectly level. "I know." Footsteps pounded heavily down the grand staircase behind me. Graham appeared in the foyer, wearing a plush white bathrobe, his hair still damp from the shower. He rounded the corner, a smile on his face, expecting to see me heading up to bed. Instead, he saw his wife of 23 years, standing in the open doorway, staring directly into the terrified eyes of his mistress. Graham stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw slackened. For a fraction of a second, I saw absolute, unadulterated panic flash in his eyes. But what happened next was far more disturbing than the affair itself. Graham didn't drop to his knees. He didn't cry. He didn't beg for my forgiveness or frantically try to lie his way out of it. He took a deep breath, ran a hand through his damp hair, and physically smoothed out his features. The panic vanished, replaced by a chilling, practiced calm. He looked like a CEO stepping into a boardroom to handle a minor public relations issue. "Serena," Graham said, his voice smooth and steady. "Please come inside." I turned and looked at my husband, genuinely shocked by the complete lack of remorse. Serena hesitated, clutching the bottle of wine tightly to her chest. But Graham offered her an encouraging nod. She stepped over the threshold, refusing to make eye contact with me. Graham led us into the living room. He gestured for Serena to sit on the leather sofa. He remained standing, placing his hands in the pockets of his robe, assuming a posture of total control. "Vivian," Graham began, using the soft, patronizing tone of a therapist speaking to a distressed patient. "I know this is shocking. I know this is painful. But I want us to handle this like adults. There is no need for screaming. There is no need for drama." "Drama?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "You invited your mistress to our home while I was in the kitchen, and you're asking me not to create drama?" "I didn't invite her," Graham corrected me smoothly. "She misunderstood a conversation we had earlier today." Serena looked down at the floor, clearly understanding that Graham was throwing her under the bus to maintain his composure, but she remained silent. "The truth is, Vivian," Graham continued, his voice dripping with faux sympathy, "our marriage has been over for a very long time. We've drifted apart. We became roommates raising children. I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't keep living a lie. Serena and we found a connection. It wasn't planned. It just happened. But it's time for us to turn the page. It's time for a new chapter." I stared at him. The sheer audacity of his narrative was breathtaking. He wasn't apologizing for cheating. He was trying to convince me that his affair was a natural, inevitable consequence of my failure as a wife. He was trying to rewrite 23 years of history to justify his betrayal. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to scream so he could call me hysterical and position himself as the calm, rational victim of a broken marriage. I refused to give him the satisfaction. "I see," I said simply. Graham blinked, clearly thrown off by my lack of an emotional breakdown. You see?" "Yes, I see," I repeated. I turned to Serena. "Get out of my house." Serena didn't need to be told twice. She stood up immediately, her face flushed with embarrassment, and hurried toward the foyer. In her haste, her cashmere wrap snagged on the edge of the console table. She yanked it free, and as she did, a thick, folded white envelope fell from the pocket of her trench coat, landing silently on the Persian rug. She didn't notice. She practically ran out the front door, pulling it shut behind her. Graham let out a long, heavy sigh, acting as if he was deeply exhausted by the burden of his own infidelity. "We will talk about this tomorrow, Vivian," Graham said, turning toward the stairs. "I'm going to sleep in the guest room. Please, just try to get some rest. We'll figure out the logistics in the morning." He walked away, leaving me standing alone in the center of the living room. The house was silent once again. I walked over to the console table and looked down at the white envelope Serena had dropped. I picked it up. It was heavy, made of thick, high-quality linen paper. I unfolded it. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't a receipt for a romantic dinner. It was a real estate dossier. Specifically, it was a finalized deposit schedule and a signed lease agreement for a stunning 3-bedroom luxury condo overlooking Lake Michigan. The lease was slated to begin on the 1st of November. The monthly rent was astronomical, but what made my blood run completely cold were the names on the lease. Graham Hartley and Serena Vale. I stared at the document, the freezing calm inside me solidifying into absolute ice. Graham hadn't just made a mistake. He hadn't just found a connection, and drifted into an affair. He had been actively, financially planning a future with this woman. He had signed a lease for a luxury condo. He had paid a massive deposit. He had a calculated exit strategy. And the most terrifying part was the date on the lease. November 1st. That was still a month away. He wasn't planning on leaving me tonight. He wasn't planning on telling me about Serena for weeks. He had intended to string me along, playing the role of the loving husband until the condo was ready and his exit was perfectly executed. The next evening, Graham arrived home from the factory at 6 o'clock exactly. He walked into the kitchen carrying a massive bouquet of white lilies, my favorite flowers. He set them on the island, a soft, apologetic look plastered on his face. "Vivian," Graham said gently, "I know things are tense. I know you're hurting. I want to give you space to process everything. I'm going to head over to the country club and stay in one of the guest suites for the weekend. I think we both need some time to cool off and think about how we want to handle this transition." "Transition," I repeated flatly. "Yes." Graham nodded, his tone deeply patronizing. "I want to be fair, Vivian, I really do. We drifted apart, but we still have kids. We still have a history. Let's not make this ugly. Let's just take a breath." "Okay," I said quietly. He smiled, clearly relieved that I was being so compliant. He kissed me softly on the forehead, a gesture that made my skin crawl, grabbed a duffel bag from the hallway, and left the house. He thought he was managing me. He thought the flowers and the gentle tone had neutralized the threat. The moment I heard his car pull out of the driveway, I walked upstairs to my bedroom, grabbed my laptop, and sat down at my desk. If he had signed a lease for a luxury condo, he had to have paid the deposit. And if he paid the deposit, the money had to have come from somewhere. I logged into our joint bank accounts. Graham ran the manufacturing company, but I had always managed the household finances. I knew our balance sheets inside and out. I started digging. I didn't have to look far. Within 10 minutes, I found a pattern. For the last 8 months, there had been a series of steady, recurring transfers leaving our primary joint savings account. $5,000 here, $8,000 there. The transfers were all labeled under the same payee, Vale Harbor Advisory, Serena's event consulting firm. My husband wasn't just sleeping with her. He was secretly funneling tens of thousands of dollars of our marital assets into her business account, heavily subsidizing the lifestyle of the woman he was preparing to leave me for. I printed the bank statements. I highlighted every single transfer. But I wasn't done. If he was moving money, he had a paper trail. And Graham was an old-school businessman. He didn't trust the cloud. He kept physical copies of everything important. I walked down the hall and opened the door to his home office. It was meticulously organized. Bookshelves lined the walls. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center. I spent 2 hours carefully going through his filing cabinets, checking every folder, making sure to place every paper back exactly as I found it. At 11 p.m., I finally found it. It was a black, unmarked folder tucked behind his old tax returns in the bottom drawer of his desk. I pulled it out and opened it on the desk. Inside was a masterclass in premeditated betrayal. There was a copy of the condo listing. There was a detailed, printed spreadsheet titled Asset Division, outlining exactly how he intended to split our retirement accounts, our stock portfolios, and the equity in our house. He had undervalued the house and heavily protected his manufacturing company, clearly planning to offer me a lowball settlement before I had a chance to hire a forensic accountant. There was also a draft of a separation agreement drawn up by a downtown law firm, heavily favoring him. But the final document in the folder was the one that truly broke my heart. It wasn't a legal form. It was a piece of yellow legal pad paper with Graham's handwriting scrawled across it in blue ink. It was a timeline. August 15, transfer final $10K to VHA. Sept 1, sign condo lease. Sept 10, move out of primary bedroom, and then, at the very bottom of the page, underlined twice, was a note that made me physically sick. Vivian will resist at first. Do not initiate separation until Lila leaves for school. Keep the kids out of the crossfire until V is isolated. I stared at the handwritten note. He hadn't just planned his exit. He had weaponized our daughter's college departure against me. He knew that if he asked for a divorce while Lila was still living in the house, she would see the devastation. She would take my side, so he waited. He played the role of the loving father. He helped pack Lila's boxes. He drove her to the airport. He hugged her goodbye, all while knowing that the moment her plane took off, he was going to pull the rug out from under my entire life. He intentionally waited until I was completely alone in this massive house, stripped of my children's daily emotional support, so I would be easier to break. I didn't cry. Tears were for a broken heart. What I felt was the cold, absolute necessity of war. Graham thought he was 3 steps ahead. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect, civilized divorce, where he would walk away with his company, his money, his mistress, and his reputation completely intact. While I quietly faded into the background, I carefully photocopied every single document in the folder. I returned the originals to the exact spot in the bottom drawer. Then, I picked up my phone and called my best friend. It was time to hire a lawyer. The following morning, my phone rang. It was Lila, calling from her college dorm room. Just seeing her name on the screen made my chest tighten. My beautiful, sensitive 19-year-old daughter, completely unaware that her father had waited for her to unpack her boxes before pulling the pin on a grenade in our living room. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to sound light and cheerful as I answered. "Hi, sweetie. How are classes going?" I asked, pacing the length of the kitchen. "They're good, Mom. A little overwhelming, but good," Lila replied. She paused for a moment, her tone shifting from casual to slightly hesitant. "Hey, is everything okay at home?" I stopped pacing. "Of course." "I don't know," Lila sighed. "Dad called me last night. He sounded a little sad. He asked if I thought you seemed unhappy lately. He even asked if I thought you might want to move closer to Grandma's house, since the house is so empty now." A cold spike of pure fury drove itself straight through my heart. Graham wasn't just planning a financial exit. He was actively rewriting history in real time. He was planting the seeds of a narrative in his daughter's mind, subtly framing me as the restless, unhappy wife who wanted to leave the marriage. He was setting the stage so that when the divorce finally happened, Lila would view it as a mutual, tragic drift, rather than a brutal betrayal by her father. He was manipulating our child to protect his reputation. "Your dad is just adjusting to the empty nest, Lila," I said, carefully modulating my tone to ensure I didn't sound bitter or angry. "Everything is perfectly fine. Focus on your midterms. I love you." "Love you too, Mom." I hung up the phone. The sheer, calculated cruelty of his actions crystallized in my mind. He wasn't just stealing our marital funds to support Serena. He was trying to steal my daughter's perception of me. I couldn't fight him with emotions. I couldn't fight him with tears. I immediately dialed my best friend, Renee Calder. Renee was 48, a fiercely intelligent real estate broker who had gone through a horrific, scorched earth divorce 5 years prior. She knew the battlefield of marital dissolution better than anyone I knew. "Renee," I said when she answered, "I need you to come over. Now." 20 minutes later, Renee was sitting at my kitchen island, staring at the photocopies of the bank transfers, the condo lease, and Graham's handwritten timeline. She didn't gasp. She didn't offer me empty platitudes about how men are pigs, or how everything happens for a reason. She simply drank her coffee, reading the documents with the cold, clinical eye of a seasoned veteran reviewing an enemy's battle plan. "He's good," Renee finally said, tapping the handwritten note. "I have to admit, Viv, he's incredibly organized. He's building a sandbox where he gets to play the noble victim who tried his best to save a dying marriage. He called Lila last night," I told her, my voice tight. "He asked her if she thought I was unhappy. He's preparing the kids." Renee looked up at me, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want to do, Vivian?" Renee asked point blank. "Do you want to scream at him? Do you want to throw his clothes on the lawn and burn them? Because if you do, I will help you find the gasoline. But I promise you, it will cost you." "What do you mean?" I asked. "If you explode," Renee explained, leaning forward. "If you act like the hysterical betrayed wife, you give him exactly what he wants. He will use your emotional reaction as proof that the marriage is toxic. He will tell the kid, "You're unhinged." He will tell his colleagues that he had to leave for his own sanity. Men like Graham do not fear tears, Vivian. They feed on them. They fear one thing and one thing only. She tapped the photocopied bank statements. "Paperwork," Renee said softly. "You don't need a shoulder to cry on right now. You need a shark." She reached into her designer purse, pulled out a sleek black business card, and slid it across the marble island. "Malcolm Pierce. Family and corporate law, call him," Renee instructed. "Do exactly what he says. And whatever you do, when Graham comes home from the country club on Sunday, you smile. You act confused. You act sad. You let him think he is entirely in control of the narrative." That afternoon, I drove downtown and walked into the quiet, wood-paneled office of Malcolm Pierce. He was 58 years old, wearing a classic, slightly outdated tweed suit. He didn't have the flashy, aggressive demeanor of the divorce lawyers you see on television. He was quiet, meticulous, and possessed the intense, observing gaze of a chess grandmaster. I sat across from him and handed him the manila envelope containing my photocopies. Malcolm put on his reading glasses. For 20 agonizing minutes, he read through the documents in total silence. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions. He simply digested the evidence. Finally, he took off his glasses and placed them on his massive oak desk. "Your husband is a very thorough man, Mrs. Hartley," Malcolm said, his voice deep and gravelly. "But his arrogance has created a significant legal vulnerability." "The affair?" I asked. Malcolm shook his head slightly. "Michigan is a no-fault divorce state. The court generally does not care who slept with whom. Infidelity is a moral failing, not a financial one." However, he picked up the highlighted bank statements. "Graham has been unilaterally transferring joint marital assets to an entity controlled by his paramour," Malcolm explained, his eyes sharpening. "This is not simply an affair. This is the dissipation of marital assets. He is using your shared wealth to fund a separate life. When we enter the division of property phase, I can legally compel the court to reimburse you for every single dollar he transferred to Ms. Vale. Furthermore, the fact that he drafted a separation agreement while simultaneously hiding assets demonstrates a clear breach of fiduciary duty to the marriage." A small, tight knot of anxiety in my chest began to loosen. I wasn't powerless. The documents I had copied weren't just painful reminders of his betrayal. They were legal ammunition. "What do you want to achieve, Vivian?" Malcolm asked, folding his hands together. "Do you want revenge, or do you want protection?" "I want the truth," I answered immediately. "He is trying to rewrite the history of our family. He wants to tell my children that we drifted apart. He wants to tell his friends that he handled this with grace. I want to leave this marriage, but I refuse to let him exit as the hero." Malcolm nodded slowly, respecting the clarity of my objective. "Then we play the long game," Malcolm instructed. "You are to remain in the primary residence. Do not move into a guest room. Do not pack a bag. If you leave, he can establish a precedent of abandonment. Furthermore, you will not confront him about the finances. You will not mention the condo. And you will certainly not mention Serena Vale." "He thinks I'm going to eventually accept the separation agreement he drafted," I said. "Let him think that," Malcolm replied. "When an arrogant man believes he is winning, he becomes lazy. He will continue to transfer funds. He will continue to communicate with Ms. Vale. My team will quietly subpoena the corporate records for Vale Harbor Advisory to trace exactly where the money went. Let him build his sandbox, Mrs. Hartley. We will wait until he is entirely comfortable, and then we will legally pave over it." I left Malcolm's office feeling a strange, hollow sense of power. My marriage was dead, but I was no longer a victim. I was an observer collecting data. On Sunday evening, Graham returned home from his weekend at the country club. He walked through the front door, looking perfectly refreshed. He had clearly spent the weekend drinking scotch, playing golf, and likely visiting the luxury condo he had secured with Serena. He found me sitting in the living room, reading a book, a cup of tea resting on the side table. "Hi, Vivian," Graham said softly, adopting the gentle, patronizing tone he had used before he left. He sat in the armchair opposite me, leaning forward with an expression of deep, manufactured concern. "How was your weekend?" Did you have some time to think? I looked at the man I had loved for 23 years. I looked at the slight gray at his temples, the familiar lines around his eyes. It was terrifying how easily he could lie. It was a difficult weekend, Graham, I said, letting a slight tremor enter my voice, playing the role of the grieving wife he expected to see. I'm still just trying to process everything. Graham nodded sympathetically. I know it's hard. But I truly believe that, with time, we will both realize this is for the best. We have to be honest about the fact that we've been disconnected for years. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste blood, suppressing the urge to scream. I suppose we have, I murmured, lowering my eyes. Graham visibly relaxed. He leaned back in his chair, a subtle, satisfied smile briefly touching his lips. He thought the heavy lifting was over. He thought the narrative of the mutual drift had been successfully planted. There's actually something I need to ask you, Graham continued, shifting gears from personal to professional seamlessly. The company's 30th anniversary dinner is this coming Saturday at the country club. It's a massive event. All the major suppliers will be there, the board of directors, the local press. He paused, looking at me with a soft, pleading expression. I know the timing is terrible, Graham said, but it would mean a lot to me if you would attend. Miles is flying in for it. I don't want the rumors to overshadow the company's milestone. It would be incredibly helpful if we could just show a united front for one night, just for the cameras. After that, we can sit down and finalize the separation details privately. I stared at him, the sheer sociopathy of his request washing over me. He didn't just want me to accept his affair. He wanted me to put on a designer dress, stand by his side, and smile for the cameras while he celebrated his success. He wanted to use my physical presence to validate his public image as a stable, respectable family man. Right before he intended to hand me a low-ball separation agreement and move into a luxury condo with his mistress. He wanted to use me as a prop in his own exit strategy. And then, a sudden terrifying realization hit me. Serena Vale was an event consultant. Her firm, Vale Harbor Advisory, frequently contracted with Hartley Precision Manufacturing. Will Serena be there? I asked quietly. Graham hesitated for a fraction of a second, but his practiced calm quickly returned. Serena's firm organized the event logistics, Graham admitted, waving his hand dismissively as if it was a minor, unavoidable detail. She will be there in a purely professional capacity, managing the catering and the venue staff. There will be no interaction, Vivian. I promise you. This is strictly about the company. He was bringing his mistress to the anniversary dinner. He was going to stand on a stage, surrounded by his colleagues, his son, his wife, and his mistress. He was going to use the event to softly introduce the concept of new beginnings and upcoming changes. He was going to lay the public groundwork for his exit, ensuring that when the divorce was announced a few weeks later, his social circle would view it as a civilized transition, rather than a scandalous betrayal. The country club ballroom was the exact room where he intended to finalize his narrative. I looked down at my hands, neatly folded in my lap. I thought about the handwritten note in his drawer. Wait until Lila leaves for school. Of course, Graham, I said, looking up at him with a soft, compliant smile. It's an important night for the company. I wouldn't want to cause a scene. I will be there. Graham let out a deep breath, clearly thrilled by my submission. Thank you, Vivian. You've always been so incredibly graceful. I appreciate this more than you know. He stood up, looking incredibly pleased with himself, and headed upstairs to unpack his weekend bag. He had successfully engineered what he believed was the perfect crime. He had secured his assets, he had secured his mistress, and he had secured the silence of his wife. He had no idea that I had spent the last 3 days turning his perfect crime into a perfectly documented prosecution. The week passed in a blur of surreal, sickening domesticity. Graham and I lived like polite roommates. He went to work, I went to the gym, had coffee with Renee, and quietly forwarded every new bank statement to Malcolm Pierce. Saturday evening finally arrived. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my dressing room. I was wearing a sleek, floor-length black evening gown. It wasn't flashy. It didn't scream for attention. It was the armor of a woman stepping onto a battlefield. I clasped a simple diamond necklace around my throat. I applied a deep red lipstick. I checked my reflection one last time. I didn't look like a broken, discarded wife. I looked like a woman in total control. I picked up my black clutch. Inside the clutch, folded neatly, were high-quality color copies of the bank transfers to Vale Harbor Advisory, the signed lease for the lakeside condo, and Graham's handwritten timeline. I walked downstairs. Graham was waiting in the foyer, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored tuxedo. He looked incredibly handsome, radiating the confident, untouchable aura of a CEO celebrating 3 decades of corporate success. "You look stunning, Vivian." Graham smiled, offering me his arm. "Thank you, Graham," I replied, slipping my arm through his. "So do you." We walked out to his waiting luxury sedan. As the car pulled out of our long driveway and headed toward the country club, Graham casually reached over and patted my hand. "Tonight is going to be wonderful," he said, staring out at the road, completely oblivious to the financial and social execution sitting in the black clutch resting on my lap. "I have a great speech prepared. It's all about honoring the past and looking forward to the future. I'm sure everyone will be paying very close attention to what you have to say." I agreed softly. We pulled up to the massive, brilliantly lit entrance of the country club. Valets rushed forward to open our doors. The distant sound of a string quartet drifted out from the grand ballroom. I stepped out of the car, gripping my clutch tightly. Graham wanted to use this room to control his story. He wanted to use my silence to protect his reputation. He didn't realize that a calm woman with evidence is infinitely more dangerous than a furious woman with accusations. It was time for the anniversary performance. The grand ballroom of the country club was magnificent. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow over the 200 guests. The room was packed with the elite of our suburban Michigan town. Corporate board members, major suppliers, local politicians, and the upper management of Hartley Precision Manufacturing. Graham walked into the room like a conquering king. He held my arm, smiling broadly, shaking hands, and accepting congratulations on the company's 30th anniversary. Our son, Miles, was waiting for us at the VIP table near the front of the stage. He looked incredibly sharp in his dark suit. He hugged me tightly, kissing my cheek. "You look beautiful, Mom," Miles smiled. "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied, squeezing his hand. "I'm so glad you flew in for this." Lila hadn't been able to make the trip back from college, but she had texted us both a long, loving message, wishing her father a successful night. Graham had read her text aloud in the car, his voice thick with fake emotion, fully aware that he was the reason she was hundreds of miles away. I took my seat at the front table. Renee, my fiercely protective best friend, was seated to my right, having secured an invitation as my +1. I scanned the room. It didn't take me long to find her. Serena Vale was standing near the massive double doors of the ballroom, wearing a stunning, deep burgundy silk dress that clearly violated the unwritten rule for event consultants to blend into the background. She held a clipboard, pretending to direct the catering staff, but her eyes kept darting toward our table. She saw me sitting next to Graham. Her jaw tightened slightly. I saw her briefly catch Graham's eye across the crowded room. Graham offered her a subtle, reassuring nod. It was a sickening, silent communication. "Don't worry, I'm handling her. The plan is working." At 30 p.m., the string quartet stopped playing. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, and a spotlight illuminated the large mahogany podium at the center of the stage. The vice president of operations stepped up to the microphone, tapping it lightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "If I could have your attention. Tonight, we celebrate 30 years of innovation, dedication, and excellence. And none of it would be possible without the vision of one man. Please welcome the founder and CEO of Hartley Precision Manufacturing, Graham Hartley." The ballroom erupted in a massive round of applause. Graham stood up. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket, smiled warmly at the crowd, and then, in a perfectly calculated display of marital devotion, he leaned down and kissed me softly on the cheek. The cameras flashed. The optics were flawless. He walked up the short flight of stairs and took his place behind the podium. He gripped the edges of the wood, looking out over the sea of faces, exuding pure patriarchal authority. "Thank you," Graham began, his voice deep and resonant. "Thank you all so much. Looking out at this room tonight, I am overwhelmed with gratitude. 30 years ago, this company was just a drafting table in a rented garage. Today, it is a family." He paused, letting the sentimental weight of his words settle over the crowd. "And speaking of family," Graham continued, turning his gaze directly toward our table. The spotlight shifted slightly, catching me in its beam. "I want to take a moment to thank my wife, Vivian. During the early years, when the hours were long and the money was tight, Vivian was the foundation that kept our home standing. Thank you, Vivian, for your support during those foundational chapters." I smiled politely, acknowledging the applause from the crowd. But I didn't miss his phrasing. During the early years, foundational chapters, he was already subtly positioning me in the past tense. Graham turned back to the crowd, his expression shifting from nostalgic to profoundly serious. "As we look to the future," Graham said, his voice dropping into a solemn, reflective cadence, "we have to acknowledge that growth requires change. The world is evolving. And sometimes, to step into our true potential, we have to make difficult, brave decisions. We have to be willing to close old chapters in order to begin new ones." He looked toward the back of the room, exactly where Serena was standing in her burgundy dress. "Both personally and professionally," Graham emphasized gently, "we must embrace the transitions that life presents us. We must move forward with grace, honesty, and a commitment to authenticity." It was a brilliant, terrifyingly manipulative speech. He was using a corporate anniversary dinner to soft launch his divorce. He was framing his upcoming betrayal not as a failure, but as a brave decision for authenticity. He was ensuring that when the separation was announced, this entire room would remember his calm, philosophical speech and conclude that the marriage simply ran its natural course. He finished his speech to roaring applause. He smiled, waving to the crowd, preparing to step down from the podium. He thought his performance was over. He thought he had won. I stood up from my chair. I didn't clap. I picked up my black clutch from the table. Renee watched me, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "Give them hell," her eyes said. I let go of her hand and began walking toward the stage. Graham saw me approaching the stairs. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He clearly thought I was coming up to give him an obligatory, photogenic hug for the cameras. He stepped away from the podium, opening his arms. I ignored his arms. I walked past him and stepped directly up to the microphone. The applause in the ballroom slowly died down, replaced by a ripple of confused murmurs. The CEO's wife rarely commandeered the microphone after the keynote speech. Graham stepped up directly behind me, close enough that I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "Vivian, what are you doing?" Graham hissed under his breath, his voice laced with sudden, sharp panic. "The speech is over. Sit down." I didn't look at him. I looked out at the 200 guests. I looked at the board members, the suppliers, our son Miles sitting in the front row. And then I looked to the back of the room, locking eyes with Serena Vale. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive ballroom. I apologize for the interruption. But Graham spoke so beautifully about honesty, authenticity, and closing old chapters that I felt compelled to share a few details about the new chapter he is currently writing. "Vivian, stop," Graham commanded in a harsh whisper, grabbing my elbow, trying to pull me away from the podium. I didn't move. I simply turned my head, glaring at his hand until he slowly released his grip. Graham quickly realized he couldn't physically drag me off the stage without causing a massive scene. So, he pivoted to his backup strategy, invalidating my mental state. Graham stepped forward, forcing a tight, incredibly nervous chuckle into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize," Graham announced to the crowded ballroom, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Vivian is just feeling a little emotional right now. It's been a long week, and the empty nest has been difficult for her. Let's give her a hand, and we'll get back to the music." He tried to signal the band leader to start playing. I didn't let him. I opened my black clutch and pulled out the thick manila envelope. I pulled out the stack of heavily documented photocopies and held them up to the bright lights of the stage. "I was emotional last week, Graham," I replied, my voice slicing through his condescension like a surgical blade. "Tonight, I'm documented." The entire ballroom went dead silent. The murmuring stopped. The clinking of silverware ceased. 200 pairs of eyes stared at the stage in absolute shock. I turned back to the microphone. "Graham is correct," I announced clearly. "We are entering a transition. But it is not a mutual drift. For the last 8 months, Graham has been unilaterally transferring tens of thousands of dollars from our joint marital savings accounts. The funds have been consistently deposited into a corporate account belonging to Vale Harbor Advisory." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Every corporate supplier and board member in the room knew exactly who Vale Harbor Advisory was. Dozens of heads instantly whipped toward the back of the room, staring directly at Serena Vale in her burgundy dress. Serena turned ghost white. Her hands flew to her mouth. She took a step backward, desperately trying to melt into the shadows of the double doors, but the damage was done. The spotlight of public scrutiny had found her. "Vivian, are you insane?" Graham hissed, his face flushing a violent shade of red. He reached for the microphone. "Turn it off! Cut her mic!" he yelled at the sound technician in the back of the room. But the technician, a young kid hired for the night, simply stared in shock, terrified to intervene in the middle of a massive marital detonation. "The money was not a corporate payment," I continued, speaking quickly and clearly before Graham could physically stop me. "Because 3 weeks ago, Graham and Ms. Vale used those funds to sign a lease and pay a massive deposit on a luxury lakeside condo. The lease begins on November 1st. Graham froze. The blood drained completely from his face. He stared at the papers in my hand. He hadn't known I had them. He thought the folder in his office was perfectly hidden. The realization that I had breached his secure sanctuary, copied his documents, and sat silently on the evidence for an entire month completely paralyzed him. "But the most authentic part of Graham's plan," I said, holding up the final piece of paper, the photocopy of his yellow legal pad notes, was his timeline. I looked down at the front row. Miles was staring at his father, his face pale, his jaw clenched tight. Graham didn't want to leave immediately. I read from the notes, my voice perfectly steady. Because he wrote, and I quote, "Vivian will resist at first. Do not initiate separation until Lila leaves for school. Keep the kids out of the crossfire until Vivian is isolated." The silence in the room was so profound, it felt suffocating. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. The absolute clinical delivery of the facts was devastating. I turned to Graham. He was staring at me, his chest heaving, his perfect tuxedo suddenly looking like a prison uniform. "You wanted to use this room to control your story, Graham," I said softly, stepping away from the podium. "You wanted to tell everyone that we drifted apart so you could walk away with your reputation intact. But you don't get to write my exit." I walked down the stairs of the stage. The guests parted like the Red Sea. No one spoke. No one moved. The sheer magnitude of the public execution had completely stunned the entire social hierarchy of the country club. I walked over to the VIP table. Miles stood up. He didn't look at me. He looked past me, staring directly at the stage. "Dad?" Miles asked, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. It wasn't a question of confusion. It was a demand for accountability from a 24-year-old man who had just watched his father's mask slip. "Is this true? Did you wait for Lila to leave?" Graham opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at the board members, at his son, at his business partners. He was a man who lived and died by his public image, and in less than 3 minutes, his image had been completely incinerated. He had no defense. The paperwork was in my hand. In the back of the room, Serena finally broke. She turned and practically sprinted toward the massive oak doors, desperate to escape the humiliating stares of 200 people. But as she reached the exit, Renee Calder smoothly stepped into the aisle, blocking her path just enough to force Serena to stop. Renee didn't yell. She just leaned in close to the mistress. Leaving the room will not make the paperwork disappear, Serena, Renee whispered, her voice dripping with lethal satisfaction. Malcolm Pierce's subpoenas will hit your corporate accounts on Monday. Serena gasped, pushed past Renee, and fled into the lobby. I stood at the front table, looking at the wreckage of my marriage. I didn't feel a rush of victorious adrenaline. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of exhaustion. But mixed with the exhaustion was the undeniable, solid foundation of absolute freedom. I turned back to the stage one last time. Graham was still standing by the microphone, looking completely lost. I do not need anyone in this room to choose sides, I announced to the silent ballroom, my voice ringing with quiet dignity. I am not asking for your pity, and I am not asking for your support. I only need this room to remember the truth. I turned to my son. I'm going home, Miles. Are you coming? Miles didn't hesitate. Yes, Mom, I'll drive. We turned our backs on Graham Hartley. We walked down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, our footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floor. Behind me, the CEO of Hartley Precision Manufacturing was left standing alone on his stage, under his spotlight, finally completely stripped of the narrative he had tried so desperately to control. The exit was complete, but it wasn't mine, it was his. The drive home from the country club was completely silent. Miles drove my car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't ask me any questions. The profound, heartbreaking realization that his father was a manipulative fraud sat heavily in the quiet space between us. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. We walked inside and headed straight for the kitchen, the exact spot where, just 1 month ago, Graham's phone had lit up with the text message that ended my marriage. Miles sat down at the marble island. I filled the electric kettle and turned it on, desperately needing the familiar, grounding routine of making tea. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out. It was a FaceTime call from Lila. I took a deep breath, braced myself for her tears, and answered the call, setting the phone up against a vase on the island, so Miles and I were both in the frame. Lila's face appeared on the screen. She was sitting on her dorm room bed, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She had clearly received a frantic, incoherent phone call from Graham, or perhaps the news had already spread through the suburban gossip network to her friends back home. Mom, Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Is it true? Did he really wait for me to leave? I looked at my daughter, my heart breaking for the pain Graham had intentionally caused her. Yes, Lila, I said softly, refusing to lie to protect him anymore. He wrote it down. He wanted to make sure you weren't here to support me when he finally pushed me out. Lila covered her mouth with her hand, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her cheeks. He called me 20 minutes ago. Lila sobbed. He was crying. He said you humiliated him. He said you ruined his company anniversary and that you were trying to turn us against him. Miles leaned forward, his face hardening with a protective anger I hadn't seen since he was a teenager defending his sister on the playground. He humiliated himself, Lila, Miles said firmly, speaking to the screen. Mom didn't make him steal money. Mom didn't make him sign a lease with another woman. All Mom did was read his own paperwork out loud. If the truth ruins his reputation, then his reputation was a lie to begin with. Lila nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. She looked at me, her expression shifting from heartbreak to a fierce, undeniable loyalty. You didn't embarrass us, Mom, Lila said, her voice growing stronger. He did. I love you. I love you too, sweetheart. I smiled, a genuine sense of relief washing over me. We hung up the phone. I poured 2 mugs of chamomile tea. Miles and I sat in the quiet kitchen for another hour, talking softly about the logistics of the upcoming week. He offered to stay a few extra days to help me deal with the immediate fallout, an offer I gratefully accepted. Eventually, Miles went up to his old bedroom to sleep. I remained in the kitchen. The adrenaline of the public confrontation had finally faded, leaving behind the stark, physical reality of what needed to be done next. I walked upstairs to the primary bedroom. I opened Graham's massive walk-in closet. I didn't throw his clothes out the window. I didn't take a pair of scissors to his expensive custom suits, emotional outbursts were for women who were out of control. I was documented, and I was organized. I pulled 3 large, heavy-duty black contractor bags from the utility closet. I methodically moved through his wardrobe. I packed his suits, his shirts, his shoes, and his expensive golf attire. I packed his watches and his ties. I cleared out his side of the bathroom vanity, dumping his expensive cologne and shaving kits into a separate bag. I carried the heavy bags down the grand staircase, one by one. I opened the heavy oak front door and placed them neatly on the front porch. I closed the door, I locked the deadbolt, I engaged the security chain. The marriage was physically over. The next morning, the sun rose over a suburban community that had been completely detonated. The financial and corporate fallout from my 3-minute speech at the country club was absolute, catastrophic, and completely out of Graham's control. At 9:00 a.m. on Sunday, Graham's phone began ringing relentlessly. It wasn't me. It wasn't his mistress. It was the board of directors of Hartley Precision Manufacturing. Graham had spent decades building a company heavily reliant on conservative, family-oriented values. His major suppliers and investors were traditional, old-money businessmen who despised public scandal. And Graham hadn't just engaged in a private affair. He had unilaterally transferred tens of thousands of dollars of personal funds to a corporate vendor, Vale Harbor Advisory, to fund a secret real estate transaction, and he had been publicly exposed doing so in front of the entire corporate hierarchy. The optics were a nightmare. If a CEO was willing to secretly siphon funds and systematically deceive his wife of 23 years, what was he willing to do to his shareholders? By Monday afternoon, the board called an emergency meeting. According to the corporate bylaws, the board had the authority to suspend the CEO pending a full forensic audit if there was reasonable suspicion of financial misconduct or a breach of the morality clause that threatened the company's public standing. Graham tried to fight it. He tried to argue that it was a private marital dispute that had no bearing on his ability to lead the company. But the board wasn't listening to his excuses. They had seen the sheer panic on his face at the country club. They had heard me read the timeline. They demanded he step down from his position as CEO immediately, taking an indefinite, unpaid leave of absence, while an independent accounting firm reviewed every single contract between Hartley Precision Manufacturing and Vale Harbor Advisory to ensure no corporate funds had been embezzled. Graham was locked out of his own building. Serena's business suffered a similarly brutal collapse. The suburban corporate world of Michigan is a remarkably tight-knit community. Word of her involvement in the scandal spread like wildfire. She hadn't just slept with a married man. She had actively conspired to secure a luxury condo funded by his marital assets, and she had attended his company anniversary dinner to flaunt her victory. By Wednesday, 3 of Serena's largest event consulting clients canceled their contracts with Vale Harbor Advisory, citing a shift in corporate direction. Her reputation as an elegant, sophisticated widow was completely incinerated. She was officially a toxic asset, and no respectable company wanted her firm associated with their corporate events. The pressure of the public humiliation and the sudden, terrifying loss of income completely broke whatever connection Graham and Serena thought they had. With Graham suspended from his company and Serena bleeding clients, the luxury lakeside condo they had leased for November first suddenly transformed from a romantic getaway into a massive, unaffordable financial liability. Desperation began to set in. On Thursday morning, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Graham. "Vivian, please. We need to talk. This has gone too far. The company is suspending me. My reputation is ruined. I know I made a mistake, but I was under an immense amount of pressure at work, and I wasn't thinking clearly. Serena meant nothing to me. It was a stupid midlife crisis. Please let me come home. We can go to counseling. We can fix this. Don't throw away 23 years over one mistake." I stared at the email. It was a masterpiece of narcissistic delusion. He completely ignored the secret condo, the handwritten timeline, and the calculated plan to wait until our daughter left for college. He reduced a highly organized, heavily funded exit strategy to a stupid midlife crisis. 10 minutes later, a second email arrived. This one was from Serena. Vivian, I am so deeply sorry. You have to believe me, Graham manipulated me. He told me you two had been separated for over a year, and that you were fully aware of our relationship. I would never have agreed to the condo if I knew he was lying to you. He used my company to hide money. Please, I am a victim in this too. I am losing my business. Please don't let him ruin my life. They were turning on each other. The civilized, mature adults who had sat in my living room and told me my marriage was dead were now throwing each other under the bus in a desperate attempt to save their own skin. I didn't reply to Graham. I didn't reply to Serena. I simply highlighted both emails, clicked the forward button, and sent them directly to my lawyer, Malcolm Pierce. The divorce proceedings were the most clinical, brutal execution of justice I have ever witnessed. Malcolm Pierce was not a man who engaged in dramatic courtroom yelling. He was a man who buried his opponents under mountains of irrefutable paper. When Graham's high-priced, aggressive divorce attorney attempted to offer me a standard 50-50 split based on the draft separation agreement Graham had created in his office, Malcolm simply smiled and opened a massive leather binder. Malcolm didn't just present the photocopies I had taken from Graham's desk. He presented the legally subpoenaed bank records, the official lease agreement from the lakeside condo, and a comprehensive forensic accounting of exactly how much marital wealth Graham had secretly diverted to Vale Harbor Advisory over the last 8 months. Michigan is an equitable distribution state, counselor. Malcolm informed Graham's attorney, his voice dripping with old-school legal authority. However, the deliberate, premeditated dissipation of marital assets to fund an extramarital affair heavily skews the definition of equitable. Your client did not simply drift away from the marriage. He engaged in a calculated financial fraud against his spouse. Malcolm leaned across the massive conference table, locking eyes with Graham, who looked exhausted, pale, and entirely defeated. We are not accepting a 50-50 split, Malcolm declared. Mrs. Hartley will retain full ownership of the primary residence. She will retain 70% of the shared retirement accounts to offset the marital funds you squandered on Ms. Vale. And furthermore, since your actions directly resulted in your suspension from your own company, severely depreciating the value of the marital estate, we are demanding a lump sum buyout of Mrs. Hartley's equity in the business, payable within 30 days. That's impossible. Graham exploded, slamming his fist on the table. I don't have that kind of liquid capital. I'd have to liquidate my personal stock portfolio. Then I suggest you call your broker, Mr. Hartley, Malcolm replied coldly. Because if you refuse this settlement, we will take this to trial, and if we go to trial, every single document in this binder becomes public record. The board of directors at Hartley Precision Manufacturing would be very interested to read the official court transcripts regarding your financial ethics. Graham collapsed back into his chair. He looked at his lawyer, desperately waiting for a legal loophole, a counterattack, a lifeline. His lawyer simply closed his briefcase and looked at Graham with a grim expression. Sign the agreement, Graham. You have absolutely no leverage. Graham picked up the pen. His hand was shaking so badly, he could barely form the letters of his own name. He signed away his house, his retirement, and the vast majority of his personal wealth in total silence. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. I never saw Serena Vale again. According to Renee, who kept a close ear on the local real estate market, Serena had to break the lease on the luxury lakeside condo, forfeiting the massive deposit Graham had paid. Without her corporate clients to sustain her expensive lifestyle, she was forced to sell her boutique consulting firm and move out of state, completely vanishing from our suburban community. Graham's new chapter was a miserable, isolated existence. He managed to keep his position at the company after the audit cleared him of corporate embezzlement, but his reputation never recovered. The board treated him like a liability. The suppliers treated him with cautious suspicion. He moved into a small, unremarkable apartment downtown, completely alone. He had planned a magnificent, civilized exit where he got to keep his money, his company, his mistress, and the respect of his children. Instead, he lost everything because he fundamentally underestimated the woman he had spent 23 years underestimating. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in my kitchen, wiping down the marble island, enjoying the quiet rhythm of my own house. The house was officially mine. The deed was in my name. The locks had been changed. I paused, looking at the exact spot on the counter where Graham's phone had lit up with that fatal text message almost a year ago. I thought about the woman I was in that moment. The woman who had dropped a dish towel in shock, realizing her entire life was a lie. I thought about the temptation to scream, to cry, to confront him right there in the hallway. If I had screamed, Graham would have won. He would have called me crazy. He would have packed a bag, walked out the door, and told everyone I was too emotional to reason with. But I didn't scream. I documented. I learned the most profound lesson of my life in the silence of this kitchen. A calm woman with evidence is infinitely more dangerous than a furious woman with accusations. Betrayal does not always arrive with a dramatic confession or a tearful argument. Sometimes, it lights up quietly on a phone while you are washing the dishes. And when it does, you have a choice. You can let the betrayal dictate your reaction, or you can take control of the narrative. You can let them plan your exit, or you can quietly, methodically, and ruthlessly plan your protection. I chose protection, and in doing so, I found absolute freedom. Sometimes, the doorbell does not bring the person who ruins your life. Sometimes, it brings the truth you were finally ready to face. So tell me honestly, if you discovered that your partner wasn't just having an affair, but was actively planning a financial exit strategy and manipulating your children against you, would you confront them immediately in a rage? Or would you smile, call a lawyer, and wait for the perfect, public moment to let their own paperwork destroy them? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.